What if I told you that the 12 men who walked with Jesus didn't just stay in Jerusalem after his resurrection? What if I told you that these ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and common laborers traveled thousands of miles across continents, faced unspeakable persecution, and died in the most remote corners of the ancient world? Today, we're going to map out one of history's most incredible journeys, the final missions and deaths of Jesus' disciples. And when you see where they went and what they endured, you'll understand why their message didn't just survive, it exploded across the known world. Before we dive into the map, we need to set the scene. It's approximately 30 to 33 AD. Jesus has been crucified, buried, and according to Christian tradition, resurrected. His disciples, these men who had followed him for 3 years, are gathered in Jerusalem. They are confused, scared, and hiding behind locked doors. The religious authorities want them dead. The Roman Empire has no idea they exist yet. But something changes. These men, who had scattered and denied Jesus during his arrest, suddenly transform into bold messengers willing to travel to the ends of the earth. Within decades, the message of Christianity will spread from Jerusalem to Rome, from Ethiopia to India, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of the known world. But this expansion came at a price. And that price was often paid in blood. Now, before we continue, I need to make something clear. The deaths of the disciples come to us through a mixture of early church tradition, historical accounts, and later legendary material. Some accounts are well attested by multiple early sources. Others are more speculative or based on local traditions that developed centuries later. I'll do my best to distinguish between what's historically probable and what's traditional belief, but understand that for many of these men, we're dealing with events from 2,000 years ago where documentation was sparse. With that said, let's start our journey. Peter. We begin with Peter, Simon Peter, the rock upon which Jesus said he would build his church. Peter, the impulsive fisherman who walked on water, who denied Jesus 3 times, who became the spokesman for the early church. According to early Christian tradition, Peter didn't stay in Jerusalem forever. Ancient sources tell us he traveled to Antioch in Syria, one of the major cities of the ancient world, where he helped establish one of the first significant Christian communities outside of Judea. But Peter's most significant journey was westward, to Rome itself. The capital of the empire. The heart of pagan power. And it's here, according to virtually unanimous early Christian tradition, that Peter met his end. The early church father Origen, writing in the 3rd century, records that Peter was crucified upside down. Why? The tradition says Peter didn't feel worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord, so he requested to be crucified inverted. This occurred during the persecution under Emperor Nero, likely around 64 to 67 AD. Excavations under St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City have revealed what many scholars believe to be Peter's actual tomb, lending archaeological weight to the ancient traditions about his death in Rome. Peter traveled approximately 1,500 miles from Jerusalem to Rome, and he died there, hanging upside down on a Roman cross, in the shadow of the very empire he was helping to transform from within. Andrew, Peter's brother, took a different route. Early traditions place him in Scythia, a region north of the Black Sea, in what's now Ukraine and Russia. Other accounts have him preaching in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and Greece. The most consistent tradition about Andrew's death places him in Patras, Greece. According to these accounts, Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross, now known as St. Andrew's Cross, around 60 AD. The Roman governor Aegiates had Andrew arrested for converting his wife to Christianity, and Andrew was bound, not nailed, to the cross, where he preached to onlookers for 2 days before dying. Whether Andrew actually made it as far north as Scythia is debated by historians, but what's clear is that he traveled extensively through the Greek-speaking world, potentially covering 2,000 miles or more from his starting point in Galilee. James the Greater, James, the son of Zebedee and brother of John, has the distinction of being the first apostle to be martyred, and one of the few whose death is actually recorded in the New Testament itself. The book of Acts tells us plainly, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword, Acts 12 verses 1 to 2. This occurred around 44 AD in Jerusalem, making James's missionary journey one of the shortest among the 12. But here's where tradition gets interesting. Spanish tradition claims that before his death, James traveled to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, to preach the gospel. After his martyrdom in Jerusalem, the legend says his body was transported back to Spain, where it was eventually enshrined in Santiago de Compostela, one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Christianity. Historians are skeptical of the Spanish mission. There's no early evidence for it, but it shows how desperately Christian communities wanted to connect themselves to the original apostles. Whether James made it to Spain or not, we know for certain he was executed by Herod Agrippa I in Jerusalem, becoming the first apostolic martyr. John. Now we come to John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and his story stands in stark contrast to the others. John is the only apostle who, according to tradition, died of natural causes. But that doesn't mean he didn't suffer. Early church tradition places John in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, where he led the Christian community and wrote his gospel and letters. During the persecution under Emperor Domitian, around 95 AD, John was exiled to the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, a Roman penal colony. It's here that tradition says he received the visions that became the Book of Revelation. There's also a tradition, recorded by the church father Tertullian, that John was thrown into boiling oil in Rome but miraculously survived unharmed, which so impressed the authorities that they simply exiled him instead of executing him. John eventually returned to Ephesus and died there of old age, possibly in his 90s, around 100 AD. He's buried in Ephesus, where a basilica was later built over his tomb. John's journey covered about 800 miles from Galilee to Ephesus, and while he wasn't martyred, he endured exile, persecution, and outlived all his fellow apostles, watching the movement he helped birth spread across the Mediterranean world. Philip's missionary journey took him into Asia Minor, specifically to the region of Phrygia in what's now central Turkey. The ancient city of Hierapolis is most commonly associated with Philip's final days. According to early tradition preserved by church fathers like Polycrates of Ephesus, Philip was martyred in Hierapolis around 80 AD. The manner of death varies in different accounts. Some say crucifixion, others say he was hung upside down from an ankle, still others mention stoning. Archaeological discoveries in Hierapolis in 2011 revealed what researchers believe may be Philip's tomb, a 1st-century structure that matches descriptions from ancient texts. Whether this is definitively Philip's burial site is still debated, but it adds intriguing physical evidence to the literary traditions. Philip's journey from Galilee to Hierapolis covered roughly 800 to 900 miles, taking him deep into Asia Minor where Greek culture and early Christianity were beginning to intermingle. Bartholomew, also called Nathaniel in John's Gospel, has one of the most disputed and fascinating travel traditions. Early Christian sources place him in multiple locations: Armenia, India, and even Ethiopia. The Armenian tradition is the strongest. Ancient Armenian sources claim Bartholomew brought Christianity to Armenia and was martyred there, flayed alive and then beheaded or crucified in the city of Albanopolis, modern-day Baku area, around 68 to 71 AD. But there's also a persistent tradition that Bartholomew made it to India. Early Christian writers like Eusebius and Jerome mention this, and some scholars connect this to the ancient Thomas Christians of India. We'll get to Thomas in a moment. If true, this would make Bartholomew's journey one of the longest, potentially 3,000 plus miles from Jerusalem to the Indian subcontinent. The method of his death, being flayed alive, is why Bartholomew is often depicted in Christian art literally holding his own skin. It's a gruesome image, but it reflects the brutal reality these men faced. Thomas, doubting Thomas, who insisted on placing his fingers in Jesus' wounds before believing in the resurrection, became, according to strong early tradition, the apostle to India. The Acts of Thomas, an early Christian text from the 3rd century, describes Thomas's journey to India where he preached, performed miracles, and eventually was martyred. Remarkably, there's a Christian community in India, the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, who have maintained an unbroken tradition since the 1st century that they were founded by the Apostle Thomas himself. The tradition states that Thomas was martyred in 72 AD near Madras, modern Chennai, on the eastern coast of India. He was killed with a spear, pierced through while praying. The Santomi Basilica in Chennai is built over what tradition claims is his burial site. If these traditions are accurate, Thomas traveled approximately 3,500 miles from Galilee to India, an extraordinary journey for the ancient world, requiring months of travel over land and sea through the Parthian Empire and beyond. Matthew, the former tax collector who wrote the first gospel in the New Testament, has multiple competing traditions about his death location. Some ancient sources place him in Ethiopia, others in Persia or Parthia. The Ethiopian tradition claims Matthew was martyred there, possibly burned alive, stabbed, or beheaded, sometime in the 60s AD. The Persian tradition places his death near the city of Hierapolis, not the same one associated with Philip. What's consistent across traditions is that Matthew traveled extensively to evangelize and that he died violently for his faith. The exact location may be uncertain, but the pattern is clear: leave Jerusalem, travel far, preach boldly, face persecution, die for the message. Matthew's journey, depending on which tradition you follow, could have covered anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 miles. James, son of Alphaeus, also called James the Less or James the Just, took a different approach. While others scattered to the far reaches of the world, James remained in Jerusalem and became a pillar of the mother church there. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records James's death. In 62 AD, during a power vacuum between Roman governors, the high priest Ananus had James brought before the Sanhedrin, condemned, and thrown from the pinnacle of the temple. When the fall didn't kill him, he was stoned, and finally, a fuller, a laundry worker, struck him on the head with a club, killing him. The early church historian Hegesippus provides additional details, saying James was so devoted to prayer that his knees became calloused like a camel's from constantly kneeling on the temple floors. James's martyrdom in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified 3 decades earlier, showed that even staying home wasn't safe. The message itself was dangerous, regardless of geography. Thaddeus, also called Jude, not Judas Iscariot, is traditionally associated with missions to Edessa, in modern Turkey, and Armenia, often working alongside Bartholomew. According to the early church historian Eusebius, Thaddeus brought Christianity to King Abgar V of Edessa, healing him and converting him, making Edessa one of the first Christian kingdoms. From there, tradition places Thaddeus in Armenia, where he was martyred around 65 AD, possibly by being beaten to death with a club or by arrows. Armenian tradition particularly venerates Thaddeus, and the St. Thaddeus Monastery in northwestern Iran, historical Armenia, claims to house his remains. His journey from Judea to Armenia covered approximately 1,000 to 1,200 miles, bringing the Christian message into regions that would eventually become among the most Christian identified in the ancient world. Simon the Zealot has some of the most far-flung traditions attached to him. Various sources place him in Egypt, North Africa, Britain, and Persia. The most common Eastern tradition has Simon traveling to Persia, where he met up with Jude Thaddeus. Together, they preached in Persia and were martyred there, Simon by being sawn in half around 65 AD. But there's also a Western tradition, particularly strong in Britain, that Simon traveled to the British Isles to preach the gospel. While historians find this unlikely due to lack of early evidence, it shows how various regions wanted to claim apostolic origins. If Simon made it to Persia, he traveled roughly 1,500 miles. If the British tradition has any validity, which most scholars doubt, that would be over 3,000 miles, one of the longest journeys of any apostle. Matthias was chosen to replace Judas Iscariot after the betrayal and death of Judas, making him the 12th apostle once again. The Book of Acts records his selection by lot, but after that, biblical history goes silent about him. Tradition places Matthias in multiple locations. Some sources say he preached in Judea and was stoned to death there. Others place him in Colchis, modern Georgia, in the Caucasus, or Ethiopia. The tradition regarding his death is that he was stoned and then beheaded, likely around 80 AD. His journey from Jerusalem, depending on the tradition, ranged from minimal, if he stayed in Judea, to over 1,500 miles, if he reached Ethiopia or the Caucasus. What's significant about Matthias is that even as a replacement apostle, he faced the same fate as the others, violent death for proclaiming a message the world wasn't ready to hear. Paul technically wasn't one of the 12 original disciples, he never met Jesus during his earthly ministry. But his conversion on the Damascus Road and his subsequent missions make him impossible to leave out of this story. Paul's missionary journeys are the best documented of any early Christian leader. We have his own letters and the book of Acts providing detailed accounts. Paul traveled throughout Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually to Rome, covering over 10,000 miles in his various missionary journeys. And Rome is where Paul's story ends. Like Peter, Paul was martyred during Nero's persecution of Christians, likely around 64 to 67 AD. The tradition, recorded by early church fathers, is that Paul was beheaded, a more dignified execution than crucifixion because Paul was a Roman citizen. The spot of Paul's execution is traditionally placed on the Via Ostiense outside Rome, where the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls now stands. Meanwhile, his burial place is beneath the high altar of that same basilica. Paul's life illustrates the transformation at the heart of Christianity, from persecutor to persecuted, from destroyer of the church to its greatest missionary, from Saul of Tarsus to Paul the Apostle. Conclusion: collectively, these men covered tens of thousands of miles. They crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. They learned new languages, adapted to foreign cultures, and faced opposition at nearly every turn. And 11 of the 12 original apostles, plus Paul and Matthias, died violent deaths. Only John lived to old age. Why does this matter? Why map out these deaths? Because it demonstrates something profound about the early Christian movement. These weren't men seeking power, wealth, or fame. These were men who had nothing to gain materially from their message and everything to lose. Skeptics sometimes argue that the disciples invented the resurrection story. But here's the problem with that theory: people don't willingly die for what they know is a lie. They might die for something they mistakenly believe is true, but they don't endure torture, travel thousands of miles into hostile territory, and accept gruesome deaths for a story they made up. The geographical spread of these deaths also shows us something else: the message was unstoppable. The Roman Empire tried to contain it, Jewish authorities tried to suppress it, local rulers executed its messengers, and still it spread. From the deserts of Ethiopia to the shores of India, from the streets of Rome to the mountains of Armenia, the message went forth. These 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, changed the world. They didn't do it with armies or political power. They did it by going, by telling their story, and by being willing to die for what they had seen and believed. When you see it on a map like this, the sheer distance, the diversity of locations, the coordination it would have required, you begin to understand why Christianity didn't just survive the death of its founder. It exploded across the ancient world in a single generation. So the next time you hear someone casually dismiss Christianity as a made-up religion or suggest the apostles were con men running a scheme, show them this map. Show them where these men went. Show them how they died. Because whatever you believe about the theological claims of Christianity, the historical facts are undeniable. 12 ordinary men left their homes, traveled to the ends of the known world, faced persecution and death, and their message survived them, grew after them, and eventually transformed the world. That's the death of every disciple on a map. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And let me know in the comments which disciples' journey surprised you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.